One of the main problems that people have with Max Stirner, especially on the left, is that his radical emphasis on exploring and basically living one's own desire supposedly advocates for selfishness in some crude sense, and that ultimately this focus on one's own desire would lead to meaninglessness and lack of empathy. So rather than being seen as the nuanced critique of alienation and a call to reclaim one's life from the grip of societal, moral, and ideological abstractions that it actually is, it's seen as a philosophical and political system which ultimately validates hedonism and lack of responsibility and empathy. In the same breath, it's often accused of being too unpolitical and following the leftist logic that anything that doesn't actively support efforts against capitalism is in support of capitalism. It makes Stirner's philosophy a supporter of capitalism. But in this video, I'm going to try to obliterate that argument and make the claim that Stirner's egoism is actually deeply critical of the way desire can be used to control subjectivity and, in turn, consumer habits, and therefore can't be seen as a culprit in the revolutionary agenda. In fact, it actually defies the leftist logic that active support is the only way to avoid supporting capitalism. To do this, we need to talk about consumption, the fundamental form of capitalism, and what Stirner actually means by self-enjoyment. So let's go. We live in a world where desire is a business. Ads promise us happiness with the next gadget. Influencers showcase their curated lives that make us click buy now. And self-help books insist that productivity is the ultimate fulfillment. But many of us never ask, are these desires actually mine, or have they been handed to me? And this is what Stirner is actually doing in his text, The Ego and Its Own. Let me show you. For Stirner, self-enjoyment is not synonymous with pleasure-seeking or indulgence. Instead, it's a radical assertion of ownership over one's desires and actions. He distinguishes between authentic desires, so those arising from the individual, and spooked desires, which are shaped by external ideals such as morality, societal approval, or religious dogma. To engage in self-enjoyment, one has to strip away these spooks and act as the sole author of one's life. But let's go a little deeper and let the man speak for himself. Let's have a look at Max Stirner's concept of self-enjoyment straight from his text, The Ego and Its Own, specifically the chapter, My Self-Enjoyment. In My Self-Enjoyment, Stirner develops a critique of alienation and submission to external ideals, and he manages to reframe freedom as rooted in the ego's capacity for self-enjoyment. This chapter is actually pivotal in elucidating Stirner's concept of ownness, which presents self-enjoyment as the practice through which the ego asserts its autonomy against societal spooks, or norms, abstractions, and ideals that demand subservience, if you're new here. So first of all, Stirner argues that all value is ultimately centered in the individual. So self-enjoyment is not a hedonistic pursuit of pleasure, but the affirmation of the ego as the source of its own meaning and purpose. Here, the egoist refuses to be a means for others, whether for God, society, or morality. Instead, the egoist treats the world as a site of appropriation, shaping it through self-determined actions. Also, Stirner dismantles the altruistic ethic by highlighting its alienating nature. So he challenges the veneration of self-sacrifice as the highest virtue by claiming that it diminishes the self and places it in service to abstract ideals. So even acts of generosity or solidarity should arise from the egoist's own enjoyment, not from external obligations or moral imperatives. Then he goes on to explain that through the lens of self-enjoyment, the world becomes a space of potential ownership. And of course, ownership, for Stirner, is not limited to material possessions, but actually it extends to intellectual, emotional, and existential domains. The ego appropriates meaning from the world not by conforming to preordained structures, but by engaging with it as a unique individual. Then Stirner critiques the idea of freedom when it's conceived as submission to higher laws, whether of reason, the state, or humanity, or whatever else. He claims that true freedom isn't about striving to meet ideals, but in dissolving them altogether. Self-enjoyment thus becomes a radical ongoing process of de-spookification, through which the ego claims its own life as property. Let's look at some direct quotes to see what Stirner is trying to say. So in part 1 he writes, "Enjoyment of life is using life up." So here he rejects the fixation on preserving life or striving for an idealized self. For Stirner, true enjoyment arises not from deferring fulfillment for some external goal, whether eternal salvation or material security or whatever, but from actively consuming life, much like burning a candle to illuminate the present. So this perspective dismantles the modern ideology of consumerism, which commodifies desire and sustains alienation by promising satisfaction through things like external goods or experiences. Unlike consumerism, Stirner's view of consumption is actually deeply personal and liberatory. It involves appropriating one's life as property, and it uses it without fear of loss or dependence on societal ideals. So in this sense, Stirner's self-enjoyment critiques both spiritual and secular poverty by proposing consumption as a form of existential freedom, or a way of dissolving the spooks of survival and idealization that inhibit authentic living. Another quote I found relevant was, "A man is called to nothing, and has no calling, no destiny, as little as a plant or a beast has a calling. The flower does not follow the calling to complete itself, but it spends all its forces to enjoy and consume the world as well as it can." So in this passage, Stirner critiques the concept of a calling or a destiny, which clearly highlights a rejection of imposed ideals and obviously aligns with the philosophy of consumption as an act of self-expression and immediacy. This passage kind of dismantles the liberal ideal of a human calling tied to a moral or spiritual teleology, and emphasizes instead the natural, unmediated act of consumption as an authentic manifestation of one's forces. Consumption, in Stirner's view, isn't just the act of acquiring a material good, but the immediate and unalienated engagement with one's environment to extract what sustains and pleases. And by rejecting the pursuit of a quote-unquote should-be self, or a lofty future-oriented desire, Stirner actually foregrounds the ego's active appropriation of the present moment. So this philosophy destabilizes the consumerist ideology that frames consumption as fulfilling an external socially sanctioned ideal, like success or virtue or happiness. And instead, it posits consumption as the ego's natural act of reclaiming the world as its own. So Stirner reframes consumption from an obligation of identity to a free expression of the individual's unique vitality. Another compelling quote from this text that I found was, "No sheep, no dog exerts itself to become a proper sheep, a proper dog. No beast has its essence appear to it as a task, as a concept that it has to realize. It realizes itself in living itself out, in dissolving itself, passing away. It does not ask to be or to become anything other than it is." In my opinion, this observation illuminates a profound critique of human consumption and consumerism. So in contrast to animals that simply live themselves out, humans have created an entire framework in which their existence is tied to the endless pursuit of ideals, whether to be perfect consumers, the ideal professional, or the proper individual. So consumerism, which is far from satisfying natural needs, turns life itself into a task to be optimized through endless consumption of goods and experiences that promote self-realization. And much like the spirit or ideals which Stirner critiques, consumerism imposes external demands and spooks individuals into believing that they must become something more than what they already are. And and the result is a servitude to market logic, where identity and fulfillment are reduced to purchasable commodities that perpetuate a cycle that never resolves but sustains itself through the illusion of possibility in consumption. Okay, one last quote I want to share is where he says, "What a man is, he makes out of things. As you look at the world, so it looks at you again." This quote, in my opinion, critiques the tendency to attribute fixed or universal significance to objects, which urges a recognition of their subjective and arbitrary valuation. So this insight is actually super relevant to the dynamics of consumerism, where the meanings of commodities are constructed and manipulated by both producers and consumers. So in a consumer society, objects are often imbued with symbolic value, like status, identity, or fulfillment, which is always dictated by advertising and societal norms and things like that. Stirner's view exposes this process as arbitrary and contingent, and it highlights how individuals project their desires and fantasies onto these products. Just as the Bible can serve as a sacred text, or an amulet, or a plaything, depending on the user, a luxury car can signify power, a reward for hard work, or merely a means of transportation. So consumerism thrives on this multiplicity of interpretations, but it also enforces standardized meanings to maintain market demand, which echoes Stirner's critique of imposed truths that override personal will. And by reclaiming the freedom to define objects according to one's own desires, Stirner's philosophy invites a kind of rebellion against the coercive narratives of consumer culture, and it urges individuals to see through the spook of fixed consumerist ideologies and recognize their role as creators of meaning, not passive subjects to it. Okay, to look more deeply into his philosophy and also strengthen his arguments, I think we should look into some other theories and align them with Stirner's ideas. So, Stirner's critique centers around the idea that desire in its purest form is a deeply personal and individual force. In the chapter My Self-Enjoyment, which we just talked about, he argues that true self-enjoyment doesn't come from external fulfillment, but from the self-directed use of one's own desires. But in the capitalist landscape, these desires are distorted. Advertisements, influencers, and entire industries craft desires for us by embedding external ideals in our psyches. So let's use Lacan's theory to look at this. Lacan's theory of the mirror stage shows us that subjectivity is constituted through an external image, and individuals come to see themselves not as they are, but through the lens of societal reflection. So for Lacan, this moment is the origin of the sense of lack that drives the formation of the subject. And capitalism exacerbates this lack by offering endless consumption as a solution, but never actually fulfilling the deeper desire for recognition of the self. And this is what Stirner urges us to do. He urges us to reject these externally imposed ideals and to recognize the self. His egoism challenges the notion that desire has to be an answer to social expectation. In Stirner's view, consumption has to become a purely personal act, or an expression of ownness rather than subjugation to capitalist forces. So when desire is no longer mediated by societal structures, it can become an act of self-expression, which is all about reclaiming the individual's freedom from the spooks of imposed meaning. Paradoxically, even a Deleuzian perspective of consumerism aligns with Stirner's thought. So for Deleuze, desire is not a lack, like with Lacan, or a response to absence, but rather an active force that creates new realities. So desire in this framework is productive. It's about becoming, about transforming the world in line with one's own desires. The key difference here is that desire in capitalism is often reduced to consumption, or a reification of desire into a static product that promises fulfillment but never actually delivers. For Stirner, this reification of desire is the spook that he critiques. So consumerism conditions desire to remain within specific limits, like the pursuit of goods, status, or like an idealized self. In this context, consumption becomes a process of submitting to external definitions of who we are supposed to become. Stirner's egoism resists this submission, and it emphasizes the need for individuals to reclaim desire from these limiting forces. So when consumption is liberated from the constraints of capitalist subjectivation, it becomes a process of becoming, or of expressing oneself freely and authentically in a world that constantly seeks to define us through commodified means. So Deleuze's idea of desire as an unformed, flowing energy actually aligns with Stirner's conception of desire as something that should be reclaimed by the individual. Deleuze is basically calling for or illuminating the de-spookification process, which Stirner wants us to think about in order to actually get to a point of self-enjoyment. So Stirner's concept of self-enjoyment as an act of appropriating the world according to one's own needs and will actually directly intersects with Deleuze's idea of desiring production, which demands the liberation of desire from capitalist structures. In both thinkers, desire is a dynamic and fluid force that is constrained by external norms, whether these be social, ideological, or in the case of capitalism, economic forces. But hey, why not add another relevant layer that can help us understand what Stirner is actually saying? So, from a Foucauldian perspective, consumerism can be seen as a mechanism of what he calls biopower, where power operates not just through coercive institutions like the state, but also through the subtler, more pervasive force of ideology and self-regulation. In his book Discipline and Punish, for example, Foucault illustrates how the body and subjectivity are shaped by external forces as individuals internalize norms and practices that guide their behavior. Consumer culture operates in much the same way by using desire as a mechanism for self-regulation. So the consumer isn't coerced into consumption, but is subtly encouraged through advertising, media, and social expectations to regulate their desires in ways that benefit the market. Foucault also has another concept which is relevant, namely that of governmentality, which is the ways in which individuals govern themselves according to societal norms, which becomes particularly useful in this context. So consumerism works not by direct force, but through the gradual embedding of desires that shape the individual self-concept. So that means that the consumer becomes a subject who seeks to optimize themselves through the acquisition of goods, constantly adjusting their desires to fit market demands. And this self-regulation is in line with Foucault's analysis of how power works on the individual. It doesn't work through direct repression, but through shaping desires, beliefs, and practices. And, well, Stirner's critique of subjectivation resists this internalization. So for Stirner, the egoist, in a very Deleuzian fashion, has to reject the spooks that bind them to these societal expectations and instead reclaim their own desires as their own. So in Stirner's terms, this means rejecting the subjectivation process that capitalism imposes on us, which is the idea that our desires and selves have to be oriented toward external fulfillment. He says that true self-enjoyment occurs when the individual liberates their desire from the forces that seek to define them. So let's finish this by briefly talking about this thing that I call de-spookification, which is at the heart of Stirner's critique. This is a process that is supposed to strip away the societal ideals and abstractions that control us. Using Deleuze and Guattari's model of capitalism in this context, this process is never-ending and it doesn't lead anywhere other than to places which have to go through the same process. So basically, the de-spookification process is ever-expanding and it's ongoing and demands intense vigilance and radical self-expression. And anything outside of this self-determined desiring machine, which you create and manage and maintain, is a spook. So consumption in this context becomes an act of appropriation, one that isn't tied to the fulfillment of any sort of external ideals or the creation of a socially sanctioned identity. So Stirner's emphasis on consumption as an expression of self-enjoyment actually aligns with the Deleuzian idea of desire as a process of becoming rather than having. To consume isn't to passively accept the consumer's script, which, remember, is very implicit and hidden and must be watched out for, but to actively assert one's autonomy over the material and ideological world. So in this way, Stirner's philosophy offers an antidote to the alienation that arises from consumerism by reclaiming consumption. By asserting ownership over one's desires, consumption becomes an act of personal liberation, one that rejects the spooks of external societal norms, whether they take the form of religious imperatives, moral obligations, or the dictates of the market. So in a Stirnerian sense, consumption isn't about becoming more aligned with an idealized self or identity as it's fed to us by the world and its capitalist agenda through its various forms of representation, but rather about consuming life in a way that is fully attuned to one's own desires and self-determined existence. Okay, friends, thank you for listening. Please make sure to subscribe, share, comment, and all that. If you feel like you have the means and would like to support the channel, please feel free to check out the membership option or the Patreon, which will give you access to some awesome perks. Also check out the Stirner project, which I will link in the description. You'll also find lots of other links that might be interesting to you there. Stay spook-free and see you next week.